take over and talk to our students in the club. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sayer, and thank you, Sajita, for this opportunity, and to the VMFT. It's always wonderful to talk to young people, because I do strongly believe that youth are the hope that we have for the future. People like us in our generation have created a mess, and unfortunately, we're leaving that mess behind. But today's youth seem to be increasingly aware of the issue, and are enthusiastic about doing something. So I'm always very happy to speak to young people, and in this case, journalists, who, because the media has such a crucial role to play also in the kind of problems that we're facing. I'm also happy that this is in honor of a newspaper and initiative from more than 100 years back to, in some sense, speak truth to power, because a lot of what I'm going to say will also deal with that. So I'm honored to be able to remember that memory. I am going to speak in three parts, and I will break my presentation in these three parts to enable some, if there are any immediate questions or comments anybody has. The first part will be the shortest, which is what I call the bad news, which is looking at the kind of crises that we are in. Most of us are, to some extent or the other, aware of these crises, so I won't go into them in any detail, but maybe in the discussion, if people want more information or clarifications, I can do that. The second part, which will be the longest, will be looking at examples from all over India and some from outside India also, of how people are responding to the kind of crises we are in. What are the kinds of solutions or alternatives that people are finding on the ground? And the third part will be from emerging from all of these different hundreds and thousands of initiatives, what are the kind of larger concepts or frameworks of alternatives, or frameworks of transformation, or frameworks of well-being and development that are coming out, which we need to push much more. So as I said, I'll break it in the middle, so that otherwise it's too long a presentation for everybody to remember. So if people have questions in the middle, then please feel free to ask when I take those breaks. Please let me know if the screen is working. Yeah, is this working? Is it full screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I'm calling this Ecoswaraj and also rainbow recovery, and I'll explain both of these terms as I go along. Now, we know, of course, that one of the dominant images of India, and especially the one that the government would like to project all over the world, is of a country that's rapidly moved into the 21st century and rapidly moving towards the 22nd century, becoming one of the world's largest economies, which it has had relatively high rates of economic growth in the last 3 decades. And many other indicators, such as, for instance, the fact that a billion people, or there are a billion mobile phone connections, the per capita income, per capita car, per capita consumption, all that kind of stuff, sort of normal indicators of economic development, have been relatively positive. That's one way of looking at what has been happening in India in the last few decades. But I think it's very important that we remind ourselves of what development means, because all over the world, every country other than Bhutan, and I'll speak about that later, uses development as in per capita, as in gross domestic product, or the rate of economic growth, as the means of determining whether we are developed, underdeveloped, developing, etc. But if you look at the original meaning of the word development, it's actually the opposite of envelopment. Envelopment means, we used to, now everybody sends emails, but we used to put a letter into an envelope and post it to a friend or a relative. So it meant covering up. Development means opening up instead of covering up. And so it actually initially meant opening up of opportunities for all of us in multiple spheres of life. No, for us to be a complete human being, of course, we need the material means of surviving, but also cultural, intellectual, spiritual, and many others. But unfortunately, in the last few decades, it has come to mean only economic, and that also only financial, mostly financial growth, measured, as I said, in terms of GDP and other such indicators. And it's actually only about 70 years old. It's post World War II. This phenomenon called development is only post World War II. So sometimes, when people like me question development, people look at me and say, it's like you're questioning oxygen. Of course, we need development. But I think it's very important to understand the history of both the term and the concept. And as I go along, I'll explain why it has become such a problematic one. So here in this image that you see, which is an advertisement from about 30 years back of an Indian corporation, um, what development really means for nature, and as I'll explain later also for people, is violence. Because in the pursuit of economic growth, whatever is in the way, if it is a forest, if it is a river, if it is an Adivasi community, if it is any other community, it's in the way of a expressway or an industry or a pipeline in this case, it has to be moved out regardless of the consequences. And so across the world, communities are rising up in protest saying that this is a form of cancer, this is violence, this is not development really. And if you look at it globally as a planet, as Mr. Sohair rightly pointed out, this is now the most serious crisis that humanity is facing. Most scientists in the world who are looking at climate issues, for instance, are telling us that within the next 10, 12 years, if we don't move really rapidly and dramatically, we will be facing various kinds of collapses, which are to do with the kind of destruction of the climate or the imbalance that we have caused in the climate. Also, the imbalances caused in biodiversity, huge amounts of loss of biodiversity. Human impact on the earth is already 1.5 times what the earth can sustain in terms of the regeneration of hydrological cycles, the regeneration of forests, etc. And even in India itself, there was a study that was done, I think, about 10 years back, which showed that within India also, we are already overstepping our natural limits. We are already unsustainable in many different ways. So these are evidences that we already have. We can see many more. You can see visuals and images of that all over the world, all over the country. You have statistics of the kind that I've put on this slide. And overall, what we are seeing is this image of a rapidly deteriorating physical and natural environment. And that has a very direct impact, not just on the wildlife and the biodiversity, but also on people who depend on this natural environment. In India, for instance, 60-70% of population is still directly dependent on nature and natural resources for everyday survival, everyday livelihoods. Um, all of us ultimately are, because without fresh air, for instance, none of us can be alive. But these are people whose livelihoods, whether they're fishers or farmers or craftspersons or pastoralists or Adivasis, they are directly dependent. So the destruction of environment has a direct impact on their livelihoods and survival. Now, we are told over the last few decades, the developmentalist ideology tells us that yes, some amount of ecological damage may be there, but it is necessary for people to move out of poverty, for jobs to be created, etc. So a colleague and I actually wrote a book, I'll show you an image of that later, a few years back, in which we did a very detailed 300 pages of assessment of what has this kind of development meant for people in terms of poverty and so on. And according to us, and actually mostly using government statistics, there is net very little new employment created in the formal economy, which is where most of the investment and the money goes. This includes IT, universities, government jobs, everything. And if you think of poverty in terms of deprivation from basic needs, adequate food, adequate nutritious food, water, clean drinking water, sanitation, housing, clothing, etc., and also access to health and education, then according to us, at least 70% of India is still poor. In fact, there are many who are not poor because they had natural resources to depend on, like the 60 million people who have been physically displaced by so-called development projects, who are now or should be counted amongst the poor. And we can see this kind of the impacts of this in the COVID lockdown. When the economy locks down, the formal economy especially locks down, and of course also then there are knockdown effects on the informal economy. you have the loss of livelihoods for tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people across the world. And we saw the very sorry spectacle of people having to walk back home because the government was simply not capable of, or probably not even wanting to assist people in either continuing their livelihoods where they were, or at least being able to um, safely transport them back home. Now, the question that arises is that if this is the case, if there is still such a large section of India's population that is deprived, that doesn't have secure livelihoods, etc., where is all the money going? If we have 5, 6, 8% growth every year, that's a lot of new money being created, new wealth being created. And it's very clear that, as in the case all over the world, in India also, the inequality has significantly been rising over the last few decades, and especially the last few years, which now enables 5% of the rich in India to earn as much as the rest of the 95%. So, just like in the US and everywhere else, this kind of gap between the rich and the poor is just increasing as a result of the same model of development. Now, I think it's very important, since I'm talking to people who are going to become journalists or already are journalists, is to also look at the role of the media in all of this. And I'll come back to that later also. But here, just to give you one comment, that as part of the same syndrome of the neglect of, or deliberate negligence towards the marginalized sections of India's population, the media is also doing exactly the same thing. There was a study done in 2011 which showed that the three top circulation English and the three top circulation Hindi newspapers, their coverage of rural issues was just 2%, even though 60% of India is still in rural, or 65% is still in rural India. So, and even in this 2%, at least some 30 or 40% was about deaths and violence and floods and so on, not so much about not so much about news. Finally, I think it's very important for us to realize that this model of development, and especially in the last few decades, what this has done is that, one, it is has destroyed enormous enormous numbers of people's livelihoods, as I've been telling you. And then the kind of jobs and livelihoods it creates in the new modern sector, some of them are very good, very dignified, of course, but most of them are mass production jobs into which each one of us will fit like a small cog in a machine, with no satisfaction, very hard working conditions, and very often underpaid. So I'm calling this whole process of the last few decades of development as one from livelihoods, which was about life, to deadlihoods. Even if we might be earning more money, we're doing it in ways that are soul deadening. And eventually, people just get completely sick and tired of it and want to do something different. Much more analysis on all of this is available in this book, which we brought out about, I think, in 2012. So it's available. Please do take a look if you want to get even more depressed than what I've just made you. I think I should end this section by just talking about the current period, which is where, if somebody wants to comment on my slides, that's fine. Which is where, if you look at the last 7 or 8 months, a period in which, in fact, society should have been much more caring about the people who are on the margins, people who've lost their jobs and so on. And we did see a lot of that. We did see a lot of civil society action. We saw communities trying to mobilize. We saw some governments, including, for instance, Kerala, doing at least what they could for the most badly affected. But by and large, what we also saw was governments, and this is across the world and in India, becoming even more authoritarian, using this as an excuse for more surveillance, more cracking down on civil society, and private sector as a excuse for, or a way by which they could make much more profits. You can see the figure there of billionaires becoming almost $600 billion richer in this period, in the same time in which hundreds of millions of people lost their life. So we're at a kind of a crossroads where we can either keep going that way, which is a society that's even more and more unequal and unsustainable, or we can go the way in which people have responded towards more solidarity, more sustainable actions, looking at really what it is that the marginalized need. And it's this second part that I'm going to try and focus on now, asking this question: are there alternatives? Are we kind of stuck to this model of development and governance, or are there alternatives? And I would very strongly assert that there are alternatives, but there's one very important condition that we have to look at for that, which is that there are a lot of what I would call false or superficial solutions, solutions that the system is giving us. So, for instance, the globe of the north, the west is telling us we'll keep polluting. You make sure you protect the forest so that our carbon is captured by you, so we can do carbon trading. Or they're saying we'll create all the technologies possible to reduce global warming and reduce carbon, not actually reduce carbon emissions from the polluting sectors, but just kind of try and protect the earth against those emissions. Or green growth, or there's so many different kinds of things which are being talked about, even things like recycling. So people aren't asking the fundamental question, why are we creating so much waste? But they're saying, okay, no, we'll just recycle everything, and that's a solution. And to a lot of us, these are very superficial solutions. What is very important is to go to the structures. Why is it that we are in this problem in the first place? And that's where I think it's very important to try and identify the kind of fundamental relations, whether it's capitalist relations or it's state domination or it's men over women patriarchy and masculinity, or it's racism or it's casteism, or it's human centered, which means that we think the world is for us and not for all the other species that we share it with. We find that it's only when we try and find answers to these, we try and challenge these fundamental structures and then find answers that are about different ways of being and doing things, then that we're actually really finding solutions. Otherwise we are living in very superficial kind of solutions. So I'm going to stop here at this moment and just pause for a minute or two and see, does anybody have any immediate questions on what I've said so far about the problem part of it? Because after this, I will move into looking at the solutions.
Sir, may I ask a question? My name is Anaksa P, and I'm a journalism student in Trivandrum Madhuvanias College.
Yes, go on.
So, we are talking about how the environment was environment in general, how governments dealt with the pandemic and development and all other political stuff. So, what do you have to say about how many governments, not just our government, use this pandemic as a cover to push environment harmful laws? There, like we know, so many governments did that, but then how do you? What do you have to say on that?
Yeah, I
Even
think.
now,
Sorry, please.
the recent issues with Goa, how they are favoring construction of rail line for transporting coal, which is
Yeah.
fundamentally against environment protection. And when we are trying so much to reduce the production of carbon and coal and everything leads to that.
Yes. So no, that's in fact exactly what I meant when I was saying that this COVID period has become a period in which we either continue pushing the more problematic parts of how we think of development, or we move towards alternatives. What the examples you're giving, the EIA notification, the coal corridor, or the coal block auctioning in central India, or what's happening in the Western Ghats, including in Goa or Northeast, etc., are all examples of using this period to push through, because it's very difficult to do democratic resistance right now. People can't be out on the streets like normal. So it's just become a very good period for the government to push through these kind of destructive projects. And it's not just about environment, it's about many, many different things that they are the agriculture bills that they brought in, the acts that they brought in just in this last parliament session. Um, the FCRA, which is the foreign funding kind of thing that was brought in by again very recently against NGOs. All of those are moves by the government to try and actually become even more, you know, control things even more,
Mm,
centralize power even more.
mm,
And even the federal structure of India has been severely threatened. So, for instance, GST has not been passed on to the states. So, a lot of states are suffering because they don't have the revenues. And that's actually technically, I think, also illegal because GST was supposed to be passed on to the states.
Yes.
So in many ways, there's this centralization that has taken place, which is very problematic.
Yes, and about the one serious aspect of the EIA was taking away the control, the any little power the state had to to control these constructions that were harmful to the environment, and centralizing the whole um, um, permission
Yeah,
structure.
absolutely. Yeah. And even doing online meetings instead of physical meeting, just have an online
Yes.
meeting within 2 hours, clear 20 projects, which is not allowing any
Mm.
kind of democratic participation.
Yes.
Yes.
Ashish, our president, Professor V.K. Damodaran, is also attending. He's an environmental activist.
Yes, yes, I know.
Sir, if you have any comments, how the students can benefit from this session, we would appreciate few words.
Apart from the artwork somebody is showing.
Hello. Damodaran
ഞാൻ
sir, കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ?
കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, but I don't know where to
Sir,
unmute.
You're already, I can hear you.
Oh, you are able to hear me. Okay. Ashish, welcome. Because a long time back, our KSSP relation,
Yes.
decades back. So I was very much interested in listening to you, but I joined 1 or 2 minutes late. But of course, definitely before you started. Well, this is actually a very major issue. And if I may say that BMFT had recently conducted what you call a web roundtable on the migrant issue, which was a national one. We had a lot of input from report just out, and its vernacular version is also expected to be out in another few days. And some of the issues that have actually you have raised there has definitely been surfaced in that meeting as well. And we conducted that meeting because the kind of the rights of the people and the feeling that has actually grown among the people for protecting the environment. Protecting the environment, I always say that it is actually protecting ourselves, not the environment. So this feeling is now being not subdued, but it is actually suppressed and maybe oppressed or even annihilated. So this is actually a danger signal for our basic democratic structure of our country. So this is happening in many other countries as well, because in many countries, authorities or those who are in power, they actually stabilize their seats by utilizing these draconian tools. And I think the NGOs as well as journalists and also civil rights advocates, they should all actually put their heads together and find ways of fighting in the post-COVID or the COVID or the post-COVID era, because it requires different tools, different media, and different approach. What we have developed for the last century or 1.5 century, they are actually tools and media that will not work in future. That has been my feeling, and you are actually currently active throughout for a number of years into this field. I think your views on it will be very illuminating for our young journalist league with the BMFT.
Thank you, Professor.
Nakha, we appreciate your intervention. I request all the participants, students particularly, to keenly listen to Ashish and raise your concerns, doubts, and how you can be active in this area and in your own profession, environmental journalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Very, very important comment. I would love to see that report. And yeah, I think maybe in the discussion later also we can come back to this, especially if the students have any thoughts on this. Okay, I have just been advised that I can switch off the annotation here so that whoever is wanting to draw on my slides can't do it. But I can't find that. Can the organizers switch off the annotation from your side?
Sajida,
Sorry, sir. Hello.
and it,
Yes, somebody is scribbling on the slides when I'm showing them. If you switch off annotation from your side, then that won't be possible.
Sorry, how to do that, sir? So, sir, you know how to do that?
I also don't know.
Ashish, can I help you? Yeah. So when you share screen,
Yeah.
if you just share your screen, you will see a tab on top.
Before sharing or when I click share?
When you click share, you will see
Ah,
a
okay,
on top.
annotate.
Yeah. And
So,
there it says switch off annotate or something like that.
It's got mouse, select text, draw, stamp, spotlight, eraser, format, undo. No, redo, clear.
No. Switch off annotate.
It doesn't have that option. That's why I think it might be with the
host.
host.
Sajida, can you
Wait,
check?
I'll just check more and see if that is there. Oh, disable annotation for others. Okay.
Right.
Got it. Thanks, Shruti.
Welcome.
Okay. So let me then move from resistance, which we are seeing all across the world, to this kind of destructive development process and the kind of authoritarian tendencies and the kind of things that Professor Damodaran also talked about. In addition to that, or complementing that, is also very amazing examples, on the ground examples of the kind of alternative ways of meeting human needs and aspirations without creating ecological destruction and without creating the kind of inequalities that I've spoken about. So in the last few years, we have been documenting or helping to document hundreds of examples of these all across India and also many in other parts of the world. And this is not just about environment. It's about food, it's about health, it's about education, it's about livelihoods, manufacturing, governance, gender issues, all kinds of everything that is relevant to social justice and human needs and aspirations. There are examples of how people are trying to do things differently. So I'm going to give you a range of these examples, and that's only a very small subset, and I'll do it very quickly. Please understand that each of these examples has its own very long and very detailed history, but obviously we don't have the time, so I'm just going to do about 1 minute each. This one is particularly inspiring for me for the last many decades. This is a group of about 5,000 Dalit women farmers in Telangana. And as Dalit women, they are already were severely oppressed and exploited and marginalized in society. Very serious levels of malnutrition and hunger, lack of access to health and education, and everything that you see with a lot of Dalit communities in many parts of India. In the last 30 years, they have actually mobilized themselves by forming women's sanghas or committees in about each of 75 villages, collectivized a lot of their farming operations, exchanged seeds with each other, knowledge that the elderly women have, passing it down to younger generations, creating grain banks in every one of those villages. And through all of these and many other means, bringing back a lot of their traditional varieties of seeds, switching completely to organic, and respecting the earth and respecting seeds. They've actually created what they call not just food security, but food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with food, or Swaraj is another term that is used. Uh, they've also moved well beyond that into having their own community radio station, filmmaking unit. They had their own running their own school for some time, and many other things. And through that, been able to sort of very significantly transform their lives as Dalits and as women, and become much more prosperous, not in terms of money, but in terms of self-reliance, especially with things like food. And in fact, so much so that the same women who were going hungry 30 years back today have contributed to the COVID relief measures in the district. including by feeding 1,000 glasses of millet porridge every day to municipal workers, health workers, and police workers in the town of Zahirabad. Another interesting and similar example is from the Northeast, from Nagaland, where this women's group called Northeast Network is working. And again, during COVID period, they were able to fall back on their own stores of knowledge and the way they use the land and their own seeds, and also be able to market in the town of Kohima, despite the lockdown, by making sure everybody was using safety measures, etc. And again, create a kind of a much more of a revive a much more self-sustaining local economy. Another example which is interesting, and that's based not just on traditional occupations, is from Uttarakhand, a women's group called Mati, which initially began with the purpose of dealing with domestic violence against women and young girls for women, and doing that through two different kinds of things. One was their own traditional products of making out of wool, handicrafts, handlooms, etc., but also the new economy and ecotourism, where people are coming from outside into this area for trekking and for bird watching and things like that. Then being able to provide very local homestays with their own cuisine and food, with their own cultures, and also training their own young people to become guides, nature guides, so that in fact the income from the tourists goes not to big tourism sector, but in fact to the local communities. And the tourists themselves also learn how to be much more ecologically and culturally sensitive. A fourth example is from Kutch. I'm going, as you can see, into all different kinds of different parts of India. In Kutch, there's been a very interesting revival of handloom weaving over the last 15 years or so, with the use of a local cotton variety called Kala cotton, which is grown organically and with very little water. And that has become a very sought after product in the market, because of which a lot of young people have either stayed back or come back. They had gone off to the Gulf countries or to industries in other parts of India. They have actually started coming back into doing handloom weaving. And what's very interesting is they're saying this is not just because of the better livelihood that we have, but actually also because we can do this at home. We are in control of our own time. We don't have any boss sitting on our head. We can work when we want, take off when we want. We are with the family, and we are carrying on our traditional heritage of the Kutchi chhap, as they call it, the Kutchi brand of handloom weaving, which is very special to that area. So you can see again, and this kind of, as I'll give you also examples in a minute, of where people are who have moved off into towns and industries are in fact coming back into villages, sort of reverse migration that is taking place. Another interesting example, which we've recently come to know, is this village also in Kutch called Kunaria, where in the lockdown period, in the COVID period, they actually, as soon as COVID was declared, they moved into their own community health system, making sure that all the proper measures were taken, making all the masks that were necessary, etc., maintaining physical distance and so on. But importantly, also saying that we will not stop our economic activities. So in fact, NREGS, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme activities continued, many other activities continued, but with safety measures in hand. Now, if that had been done all across the country, we would have seen a very different situation than what we actually did see, with the kind of mass distress that the lockdown had created. So they created a disaster management committee, a health management committee was already in place, which got activated. And now what they're talking about is the realization that these kind of crises might hit time and again, and we need to be as self-reliant and self-sufficient in our economy and our society as possible, which means that even a lot of the things that we buy in the market for our daily consumption, like soap and footwear and detergents and so on, why can't we produce these things within our own cluster of villages? Why do we have to pay? They pay 40 lakh rupees. They spend 40 lakh rupees a month on these sorts of items, and say, why should we spend all that money? We can save it if we create the production facilities within our own is so important, because we see thousands of units of small scale or medium scale production of these kind of household goods or crafts or products which are in use every day. So that's the kind of example which, and here of course there has been state support for this, which is very important. Another similar example is from Jharkhand called Jharcraft. So this kind of initiative at trying to create um, more self-sufficient. I mean, I know all of these, I should have started by saying that all these examples have their own problems and we can get into those, but they all show the potential or the possibilities of the kind of transformations that we want to see. I don't know Kerala that well, but the few that I do know, of course, also there are many similar alternatives that we see of people doing things with ecological regeneration and with marginalized sections of population, especially in mind. So if we take a lot of these sorts of examples from villages in different parts of India, you see that, this uh, notion that inevitably people are going to move from villages to cities. Inevitably, villages will be poor, cities are the ones where there is wealth, is false. We can actually reverse that. We can defeat that logic, as is the case with the examples I've been giving, and many others like the ones on this slide. And people have come up with models of what kind of a localized economy could exist, which would create that kind of self-reliance and reduce the dependence on both the centralized government and the and private corporations. But of course, cities will still exist. So we also need to find solutions for urban sustainability and for the kind of inequalities and injustice that exists in cities. So this is an example from Bhuj, again, Kutch. As you can see, I'm taking many examples from Kutch because I think it's a very badly neglected and unknown part of India. And it's interesting that so much innovative stuff is happening there. So this is 5 or 6 local civil society organizations that have teamed up to try and ensure that the poorest sections of Bhuj, so-called slums, are the ones where people can gain the capacity and the confidence to self-govern, to create their own local self-reliance on things like water and housing and livelihoods, to empower women, especially young women, so that they can create much more safer conditions and also have better livelihoods, and many other such things that they're doing as part of this program called Homes in the City. And we also see it's not just in poorer colonies, but at least some parts of the middle class in India in cities are also kind of waking up and realizing that they can't continue living the kind of very wasteful lifestyles that they have. They also need to do something to be responsible towards the environment and towards other people. So again, many examples that we have now of communities or colonies or housing societies or resident welfare associations taking up things like regenerating natural ecosystems, recycling their waste, recycling water, becoming much more self-sufficient with decentralized local renewable energy, and also moving back into a system of shopping without creating waste. Now, I remember when I was small, I could go to the local Kirana shop or the grocers and not have to buy things in double layers of plastic and so on and so forth. I could, buy things without this kind of wastage. Unfortunately, now everything comes in plastic. And in fact, in COVID times, even more plasticization has happened because for some reason, we seem to think that if something is in plastic, it won't have the virus. So these are like the example you see on the bottom right-hand side there. These are examples of shops that are bringing back non-packaged materials. So you can go with your own vessel, or at the most, they'll give you a paper bag in which you can buy things so that you don't create the waste in the first place. Now, I also want to go into the aspect of governance a bit more deeply. So this is an example of 90 villages in central India. These are Adivasi villages who have who got together partly to oppose very destructive mining that the government was proposing there, but also to assert their rights over the forests, which, as you know, during colonial times, the central government had taken control over most parts of India's forests. So these are examples where they have reclaimed their collective rights to those forests. And with that, stopped external destructive industries and started creating their own sustainable harvesting of forest produce. and through that be able to generate community funds, village funds that have in fact been very, very useful in the lockdown period to sustain parts of their population, migrant workers, for instance, who had come back and who didn't have any land to fall back on, or who didn't have any livelihood to fall back on. So without having to depend on government, they had their own resources to be able to sustain their population in these last few months. And one of the slogans that they have, emanating from an earlier example of a village called Mendha Lekha, is that while we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai, in our village, we are the government. Now, this is a very, very, very interesting and very noteworthy shift in the way democracy is looked at. And I'll come back to that when I talk about the frameworks of transformation. We've put a lot of these examples together in 2 volumes of what we call the extraordinary work of ordinary people, and there'll be another 3 or 4 volumes coming out. So about 20-25 stories are already there of how communities, because they had mobilized themselves, because they had created these local systems of self-governance and self-reliance, were able to cope with the COVID crisis much better than other parts of India. I will put up links to these documents in the chat once I finish. And in fact, similar to the Central Indian example I just gave you, there are hundreds of examples of around the country and thousands around the world of people either sustaining their own local governance of nature and natural resources or reasserting it in new ways. So this is a very interesting phenomenon of how conservation is also taking place as a democratic exercise, not as a top-down government exercise. I also want to talk very quickly about 2 or 3 other sectors which are so crucial if we want these kind of transformations and solutions to emerge. Very fundamental to all of us is our education system, which currently the dominant education system tells us things that are completely different from what I've been talking about. It tells us that we have to be competitive, hostilely competitive. We have to leave everybody else behind. Our goals in life should be to become rich and famous and powerful. And it also basically tells us that what is creativity, what is innovation, what is intelligence, is all things that we are told. It's not something that's born in us, that kind of can be inculcated from us from childhood. So these are examples. The ones that you see on the screen now are examples of learning institutions that are trying to do things very differently, that are trying to create conditions in which learning is done by fun, by enjoyment, where the students and the faculty are together making curricula, where learning is also happening within the community, not just in the classroom, where learning is also happening in relationship to the rest of nature, and where there's a sense of responsibility also, of collective doing and thinking and being that is inculcated in students. One of my favorite hobbies is to look at the origins of words. And when I started doing this kind of work, I learned from somebody who told me that the original meaning of the word school, which is from the Greek schole, meant leisure. Now, as we know, most schools in India are anything but leisure. They're mostly prisons. But in fact, that's what schools or learning institutions should be about. The same goes for technology, where we have centralized a lot of our technological innovations, where we think of technology creators as being those who are in corporations or in centralized government institutions. Whereas in fact, most technological innovations through history have been created, by ordinary people. And so how does one re-democratize science, knowledge, and technology is also very much part of the alternative. Here, there are some examples of, for instance, alternative housing. I already spoke earlier about the work of Laurie Baker and others in Kerala, but across many different parts of the country, we see this kind of either alternative housing or decentralized renewable energy, or creating innovative ways by which so-called disabled people can function as well as anybody else, and many other kind of technological innovations that are pro-environment and pro-people. Finally, also the media. And of course, for all of you, this is the most important, that we have seen that whether it's arts or media or other forms of communication, again, there's a control by either the state, like when Doordarshan was the only channel that was available, or private corporations, which is the case with most newspapers, television channels, etc. these days. So how does one also re-democratize the media space and the art space and the communication space? So again, one is of course to continue fighting for accountability of the mainstream media, but the second is also to support and be part of the alternative media. And again, these are some very interesting examples of where people are struggling and trying to find forums and media and platforms by which people's voices can come out. Community radio, for instance, more than 150 of them in different parts of India, using mobile phones to spread the message as far as possible, for instance, CG Netswara in Chhattisgarh, and many, many others, which are very, very interesting, which I would urge all of you as media students to look at. Now, when this kind of action happens on the ground by people, and there is people's mobilization and civil society action and so on, we also have governments responding. Every once in a while, there are people within the government as politicians or bureaucrats who are more sensitive and who say, yes, we should bring in the right policy or we should implement a good policy. And so we've seen in the last few years, last few decades, some progressive laws and policies and schemes coming in. And again, Kerala has been one of the leading states in this, but even at the central government level, we see, for instance, laws on the right to information or on employment or on forest rights, which I mentioned earlier, or schemes for organic farming and renewable energy. These are all examples where, if pushed adequately by civil society and movements, and where practical examples are in fact shown that this is possible, then even governments can respond positively. Now, I will spend another 2-3 minutes looking at examples from around the world and then again stop and wait for questions and then get into the last section. So firstly, for a lot of you on this call, this map will probably seem to be upside down. Normally in a physical classroom, I would have stopped right now and said, does anybody think there's anything wrong with this map? And so far, most people have put up their hands and said it's upside down. Well, it's actually a very interesting way of looking at the world, because the so-called right side up map, or the so-called normal map, is a product of colonial times. It was made at that time when Europe was kind of ruling half the world. Europe was shown to be on top, and it was shown to be much bigger than it actually is. You can see the actual sizes of the continents here. See how big Africa is and how small Europe is, and England, in fact, completely disappears. So in one way, we have a lot of these new tools now to decolonize our minds also, no? Because even our minds are like, okay, what is the normal language? What is the normal map? What is the normal XYZ? Is things that are taught to us from a lot of them from colonial times or because of centralized systems. But I also want to put this map up because just to give you names of a few examples of the most amazing alternative initiatives in different parts of the world. I'll show you the cover of a book later on, which you can download for free, which has 100 examples of these kinds from different parts of the world. But just to give you 2 or 3 examples, one that I find very inspiring and is from what I think is the most war-torn region of the world. This is the area between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, where the Kurdish ethnic community is trying to create its own autonomous region of governance, of self-governance. And at least in some parts of this, they have done that through very radical, similar to the central Indian villages, saying that every local community will govern itself. And then you'll be federated over a larger landscape for the whole Kurdish area. And that these governance will be based on ecological and feminist principles, so principles of peace, principles of working with the earth, and principles of equality and equity. So it's a very, very interesting example. I urge you to look at it. There's a lot of material and literature on this available. Other examples are from Europe, which I have visited, so I'm a little familiar with them. And these are examples of what they call social and solidarity economy, which is trying to move away from the dominant economy and creating localized economies that are much more self-reliant or much more dependent on local capacities. So the one on the bottom left-hand side, for instance, is an alternative currency. where instead of using the centralized euro, for some operations at least, they use their own, they've created their own currency called the Beki, and they use that for local exchanges like buying bread, and the bread maker can buy grain from the farmer, and the farmer can go to the doctor and use the same currency. So what it does is it stimulates the local economy and it reduces the dependence on the centralized economic system. The other example is a similar one, but using no currency at all, except time, where they say that similar to traditional across India, across the whole world, traditionally, we used to help each other, right? If a farmer had to harvest his or her crop, other farmers would also land up to help. And without any money, at the most, maybe the farmer would have to give a feast. That is kind of gone mostly out of the window now because everything is done through commercial means. So here there are examples of what they call time banking, in which they bring back these notions of non-monetary exchanges of services and goods. So this school in Athens in Greece is run with very high quality teaching, but very cheap, because at least a part of the teaching and the administrative work is done by parents offering their free services. And that's called time banking. So basically I say, okay, I will do 3 hours of free service a week, and here are my skills. Somebody else offers 5 hours, somebody else offers this. And with a circle, the community as a whole, everybody benefits in one way or the other. The final example on the top left-hand side is of young people in also in Athens, creating a non-profit cafe. And they're saying that, yes, we want to do an economic activity and we want to earn money, but we don't want to earn profits. We don't want to exploit the system to be able to get richer and richer. We want to enjoy ourselves. So yeah, okay, let's set up a cafe which which serves organic coffee and local food, and it employs mostly refugees and so-called disabled people. And this is not a single example. There are hundreds of such examples in different parts of Europe where people are having fun and they're living a good life. They're living a dignified life, and they're helping people who are marginalized through that. Ethical hacking, open software, alternative media. I already spoke to you about transformative arts. In South India, there's this amazing group called Justice Rocks, which does a lot of musical concerts and videos. For instance, they did these two amazing videos against the Kodaikanal mercury dumping, and many other such things that we see in India also. There's a movement called municipalism in some parts of the world, where what they say is that politics itself, instead of being this hostile, fraud-ridden kind of arena that we see today with elections, could be an arena in which we work with each other, where power is not about domination, but power is about doing good things with each other. And it's called feminist governance or feminist politics. There are many good examples of this again in Europe and other parts of the world, where they're trying to create cities which are based on much more solidarity, much more working with each other, much more listening to what's happening on the ground, much more democratic participation. And as a result of these sorts of movements, people across the world are also coming up with what they call people's COVID recovery plans, not the ones the governments are proposing, which is mostly about bailing out the big industries, aviation industry and the banks and so on, but actually people oriented, which can be based on reasserting the livelihoods and the needs of people. Now, if you take a lot of these sorts of different examples together, one of the questions I often get asked is, okay, you have all these thousands of small examples, but how does that make the larger picture change? That's a very difficult question, but one that has to be addressed. To my mind, there are 4 or 5 things that need to be done. And I'll stop after this slide for a few minutes for any questions. I mentioned the resistance, the satyagraha and all those kinds of movements in different parts of the world. And I've spoken about the constructive, the alternative movements. Bringing these together, sometimes they're part of the same movement, but if not, bringing them together to create both the resistance to the dominant economy and politics, but then also say, okay, this is what our solution is. That creates possibility of a greater change. Pushing also at the same time for policy shifts of the kind that I mentioned earlier. Supporting the movements of those who are most marginalized, women's groups, Dalit groups, Adivasi groups, etc. And even as we do all this kind of ground transformation, continuing to think big, to think of what would be an ideal society that we want. So I'm going to stop here at the moment and then get to looking at what kind of overall frameworks are emerging from this. But let me stop to see if anybody has questions on all the different examples that I've given you.
It's me again, Saranagha from Trivandrum. I have two things to ask. Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So, what do you think about shifting the blame from corporations to the overpopulation in rural areas and slums, which are a result of unplanned urbanization, for hazardous effects on environment and other issues that are used to shift the responsibility from actual accountable, the people that need to be accountable, like corporations and urban bureaucrats and other people?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So for a long time, I remember when I was in school, I was always told that India's population is the biggest problem.
Yes, sir.
I don't want to deny the fact that population is an issue. Demographics can certainly be an issue, especially in certain situations. But to me, a much bigger issue and a much more fundamental issue is about the structures of oppression and inequality and unsustainability that we have, which I mentioned right at the beginning, whether it's patriarchy or capitalism or statism or casteism and so on. And here I think it's important, Anaga, not to think of only corporations and government agencies that are responsible, but also in some senses many of us, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of the kind of consumption patterns, for instance, that many, I can speak for myself, that I don't live a sustainable life.
No,
and I think no,
yeah, that is.
let me finish.
Okay, sorry.
I think most people on this call, if you are on this call, you're using, each one of us is using some kind of a device which has probably come from mining somewhere on the planet, and is using energy which is probably generated unsustainably somewhere. I'm not suggesting, therefore, that we all stop our consumption completely. What I'm saying is that actually the kind of decisions that are taken by bureaucrats and corporations are backed by people like us sometimes in the way we live, or because we don't really resist, or because we don't protest, or because we're not part of the alternatives. And I think in that sense, some of the responsibility also has to lie at ourselves. Or for instance, how we treat democracy. I'll come back to that when I finish my presentation. We think of democracy as just going once in 5 years to elections and voting for whoever we think is the right person. Actually, democracy is about us assuming power where we are. But most of us are too lazy to do that, or don't even think that we can do it. So I think it's a very complex situation, but population is, to my mind, a very small part of the
Yes, that is true.
equation.
And about the responsibility of ourselves, who there is this thing, there is this topic I read about online called activism guilt, where activist guilt or activism guilt, I'm not
Guilt
sure.
activism, yes.
Yeah, so that is where when you I can like when you consider an environmentalist who is in Israel or Israel, and in Israel you don't have clean water resources, natural clean water resources, and you have to depend on water that is filtered and sold from the that is seawater filtered seawater. So, for example, if somebody asks an activist about why you are you using bottled water, then you're an activist. But the predicament is that you cannot have another source of water. So,
Yeah, but I mean that's one kind of example. I can give you, for each such example, I can give you 10 examples where we actually do have a choice and still don't exercise that choice.
yes,
So I think
yeah.
it's important to look at where we don't have a choice. See, there are two kinds of ways to think of this in terms of consumption or how we live our lifestyles, right? So let's take cycling as an example. And for me, that's a very live one because I try and cycle to office and back every day, is that cycling is a very individual act. I can decide to cycle, or I can decide to take a motorized two-wheeler or a car or whatever, right? But it's also a society, it's also a collective decision, because if the cycling conditions are not adequate, if they're not safe, if they're too polluted, then the chances are that I will not cycle. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's both an individual choice and a collective thing,
Yes.
and where we need to act on both. And so sometimes I won't have a choice. If I'm a parent, I would probably not want to send my children to school on a cycle because it's too dangerous. So in that
Yes.
sense, I don't really have a choice. But I do have a choice to join into group advocacy, asking for cycle tracks or asking for safer cycling conditions. That's one example. There are many others where, in fact, I do have a choice. For instance, I have a choice not to use a refrigerator, and I haven't used one for the last 15 years. And I think everybody tells me that no, a refrigerator is a absolute necessity. I can say, sorry, I've lived 15 years. I am still alive, and I'm not suffering. So I think
Yes, that is.
there are many different ways to look at this.
Yes, it is also
Can
part
I
about.
suggest if somebody else also, because otherwise this will become you and me
Yes,
conversation,
that is true.
which I'm happy to continue, but just in case somebody else has any
Yes, sure.
comment.
Shall I also ask one question, sir?
Please go on.
So in the first session also you were talking about the alternative models, and in the second also. So for a journalism student, I think they will come with a kind of fire in their mind in the first year classes. But when they go out after 2 years of training in a master class or 3 years after the degree class, they will be normalized and there won't be any fire inside the students. They will just go outside the campus. The only difference is they will be having a certificate with them and the fire won't be there. And in my opinion, the main problem is we don't have teachers like you in the classrooms. For example, in my experience when I was in Ethiopia, so there the universities, it is compulsory that a teacher should spend 33% of time in teaching, the next 33% research, and next 33% community service. In that community service, actually we get lot of experiences and we get lot of opportunities to know and to come to know more about these alternatives, because these people, mostly the rural people, they will be testing these alternatives and we teachers will get an opportunity so that we can transfer this fire or these alternatives to our students. But in our country it's not happening. So once you are a teacher, you're stay safe. You just teach the content which you studied, and you be there. And how our journalists can how we can expect that they will have the experiences of these models, and how we can change it, or how we can just have another alternative so that our students also come out with the same fire in their minds.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right, and you're referring to the slide I had on alternative education. So whether it's journalists or any profession, the same story repeats itself. You know, there is a certain enthusiasm and a certain idealism with which a lot of young people will come into the college, and even before that into school. But then they're kind of beaten down into being just cogs in the system. So I think what we need to do is argue for and advocate a fundamental change in the system. So the kind of example you gave, for instance, of one third, one third, one third, is the sort of transformation we need. I'll give an example. There are institutions in India which do that. So, for instance, there is the course on development practice in the Ambedkar University in Delhi, which is very interesting because it's not development studies, it's development practice. And what the students do in those 2 years of masters and then in their MPhil is they spend a substantial amount of time in a single community. So they're doing all the theoretical studies and all of that, but they also are getting the practical experience. And what that has created is many of the students have actually, after finishing their studies, have gone back to that community and started working with them and helping to create transformations. Amazing examples of that kind which are available. Even if they don't do that, at least they have learned much more. Their horizons are much broader than if they had stuck to just being in the classroom and done their studies. So I think that kind of system can be brought into all institutions. And the examples I gave on the slide of learning institutions are exactly that, like the Adivasi Academy in Gujarat is of that kind, or Sekmol in Ladakh is of that kind. And in fact, in Ladakh, they've just started the Himalayan Institute of Alternative Learning. The same person, Sonam Mangchu, who set up Sekmol, has also set up this HIAL, which is for Ladakhi youth to be able to understand their own roots, understand their own ecology, but also learn about everything from outside Ladakh, and put the two together to sort of create possibilities for themselves. So I think that's the kind of institutional transformations that we need. Unfortunately, our education policy seems to be going in completely the opposite direction. Anything else? Otherwise,
Ashish, you're a gifted writer who has published so many papers, books, and volumes on so many top areas, particularly environmental subjects. What do you advise the students, our students, to identify topics and develop a skill for writing? So this is basically lacking, the reading and writing side, essential for journalism career. And most students are not paying enough attention to develop the skill. So as a person with immense experience in this area, what do you advise them? How do they develop an attitude for identifying areas and collecting data and start writing and publishing and all that? Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to come to that somewhere towards the end, but since you asked, just to give you a clue of what I will speak about at the end is, I think we all need to spend much less time on the so-called social media and spend much more time on the conventional media, or what in fact now there's a movement called slow media, like slow food and slow knowledge and all, because we got so used to fast food and fast everything. And I think social media, it has its enormous benefits and so on, but it has this huge problem of everything being short and rapid. You know, Twitter length and the rapidity of whatever, right? And these new things in which something lasts for 30 seconds and then disappears. So I think that's really spoiled an entire generation or two generations of what it means to actually read properly and write properly. But so if it's okay, I'll come back to that to somewhere towards the end, and maybe some of the young journalists have some points to make also.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's quite,
but it's a very important here. Yeah. Should I carry on then and finish with the?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so in terms of learning, so sort of lessons from all these different kinds of examples, and if somebody asks, okay, if you don't want this kind of development and governance, what is it that you want? The overall macro picture. So we have, some of us have called it Ecoswaraj, which is sort of going back into the notion of Swaraj, which is a very important ancient Indian concept. It became popular during the independence movement, but it's actually much older. And essentially what Swaraj means is not just independence from a ruler or from a colonial power, but it means being free and independent, but with responsibility towards everybody else's freedom and autonomy and well-being, which means it's not the American notion that I will run my SUV wherever I want because I have Swaraj, but really saying, yes, I can do what I want, but only insofar it doesn't undermine somebody else's capacity to do what they want. And that somebody else includes non-humans, so the rest of nature. So we can think of it as a sort of a radical democracy, which has got ecological roots to it. I want to emphasize again here the use of words. Like I said, my hobby is to look at the old meanings of words. Radical, unfortunately, these days we're saying radicalized youth and radicalized religion and so on, is the wrong use of the word radical. Radical is a very good word. It means going to one's roots. as human beings, or as spiritual, or as ecological beings, or whatever. And so I'm using the word radical in that sense. Democracy meaning power where we are, where citizens are, where people are, not power with bureaucrats and politicians. And if we think of it that way, then whether we are in an educational institution or a village or a city neighborhood or whatever, we should be exercising that power, but in with responsibility. So that's what Ecoswaraj or radical ecological democracy would be. And it has 5 different crucial parts to it. So the examples that have been given you actually relate to these 5 spheres. Politics, which is what you see on the top right hand side, economics, what you see on the right, social justice on the bottom, culture and knowledge, and ecology. And I will very quickly go through a few slides trying to explain what does this mean, what is the kind of changes or transformations in these 5 spheres. So with politics, if you remember the central Indian village Mindha Lekha and the 90 villages that I spoke about, what they were arguing for was um, a new politics in which democracy and Swaraj is about we are the government in our village, or we are the government in our urban neighborhood, which means decisions should be taken by us, or at least we should be central to that decision making. So that's called direct democracy or radical democracy or participatory democracy. And then you can think of larger landscapes. So for instance, suppose I'm a village and I'm governing myself in, at least for my basic needs. I'm part of a larger tehsil or district or state or whatever. So you need decision making also at those larger levels. And that's where the notion of accountable representative democracy becomes very important, which we've been trying. The right to information, the social audits, all these things that have emerged in the last few years in India are an attempt to try and make the government accountable to people, right? So that has to continue with even more such kind of mechanisms and measures. But one very interesting thing, and this is something I'd really like maybe some of the young people to take up if they want to, is to start reimagining political boundaries. So we've got Kerala, north of Kerala, we have what's north of Kerala? So okay, so if you look at the Western Ghats as a whole, there's Gujarat, Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka, Kerala. Now, if you want to think of planning that is ecologically sensitive, we have to think of the Western Ghats as a whole. It's one ecological unit, but it has been broken up by these political boundaries. And even the political boundaries are sometimes a problem for cultures, because if you look at the sort of transboundary area between, say, Goa and Karnataka, or Maharashtra and Goa, you find that there are peoples and cultures that have been cut into two by these political boundaries. You can extend the same thing across South Asia and say, between India and Bangladesh, the political boundary that's been drawn is bang in the middle of the Sundarbans forest, which is where the fishing communities survive and the tiger survives and so on. And it makes no ecological sense or cultural sense. So we begin to rethink political boundaries also from an ecological and cultural sphere. And I'll show you a map in a minute of maybe what a South Asia could look like, which could also then deal with issues of international conflicts or interstate conflicts of the kind that we see. For instance, with water, the sharing of water between um Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, for instance, or the sharing of water between India and Bangladesh, is a constant source of conflict. It's because we haven't looked at the river basin as one political unit. If we start thinking of it like that, we actually do a very different kind of decision making and planning. So maybe for the future, this is obviously very difficult, but for the future, we can think of a South Asia that doesn't have all these fences and borders and police and army in the middle of ecological zones and culturally linked zones. Um, Tibet and Ladakh are part of one big, huge trans-Himalayan plateau. Now there's a big fence in the middle. So nomadic communities who used to go back and forth can't do it anymore. Wildlife that used to go back and forth can't do it anymore. We should think about breaking that down and actually having that whole area as a Tibet Ladakh governed region by the local community. You might think this is an impossibility and I'm dreaming and all of that, but think about the fact that actually in some parts of the world, this has already happened. Countries that were at war with each other, in Europe, for instance, in Europe, World War II, European countries were killing each other in millions. Then they arrived at the European Union, in which, at least for the citizens there, you don't even need a visa to travel from Germany to France or wherever. So it's possible. The second major transformation is in economics. So when you have the Dalit women farmers of Telangana saying that for food, everything should be in our control, they're talking about the fact that the means of production have to be in the control of the producers, not owned by capitalists or by the state. So, but also they're saying we have to be responsible to making sure that the earth is secure, seed diversity continues, the environment is protected. So economics as part of ecology, I don't know how many of you know this, but no economics department in India has an ecology section. And what everybody has forgotten is that both economics and ecology come from the same original word called oikos, which in Greek meant home. Economics is the management of home. Ecology is the understanding of home. Now, how can we manage our home unless we understand it? So in fact, economics should be within ecology. Unfortunately, that's not how economics as a discipline is at all. But this new economics would also then mean, instead of this economic globalization where we are dependent all across the world on even on basic needs, and which then collapse in something like COVID, we have to have much more localized self-sufficiency, self-reliance. That's the examples that I've been giving you. Producers in control of production, demolishing this divide between work and leisure. If you remember the Kutchi weavers that I spoke about, they were saying that we have come back to this because we also enjoy doing this work. So work being enjoyable, so you don't wait for the weekend to enjoy yourself. And questioning private property. This is again very, very difficult. But we realize in all of these examples that I gave you is where they're saying, at least for nature, for land, for natural resources, and for knowledge, it should be everybody's heritage. It should be common property and not privatized. Unfortunately, the economic direction our country has taken for many decades, this is not just with this government, has been completely in the other direction. So in May and June, when Prime Minister Modi announced the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, we all looked at it and saying, oh, wow, finally there seems to be realization that we need to be self-reliant. He even spoke about how from the village to the nation, we need to be self-reliant. But if you see the package itself, it's actually completely the opposite. It is about giving coal auctions, coal mining auctions in central India in the name of self-reliance. It's about bringing much more industry commercialization into each of these sectors. It's not about empowering craftspersons to be self-reliant and be able to do things like what the Kutchi example that I gave you of handlooms. So in that sense, you really see that, in fact, the state is meaning something very different. The third sphere is about justice, because you can have a localized village panchayat with local democracy, but it can be extremely patriarchal and extremely casteist. So you also need the struggles of against casteism, against gender discrimination, against what happens to so-called disabled people, etc., as part of this transformation. Fourth, culture and knowledge. We see in India right now this imposition of a single religion over everybody else, or we've seen for many decades the imposition of modern science and technology over all other forms of knowledge. Whereas in fact, the alternative worldview would say we need a diversity of cultures, a diversity of languages, a diversity of knowledge systems, a diversity of medicinal systems. And again, Kerala is much more progressive than many other states in that. We need, like the map that I showed you, the decolonizing of our own minds, the democratization of science and technology and other forms of knowledge, the the fact that innovations can be happening by any of us. It doesn't have to be only through centralized institutions, and the media also being part of the commons, and then the ability for all of us to understand ourselves, to go deeper within ourselves in many different ways. And finally, the fifth sphere is that of re reimagining our relationship with the rest of nature. Firstly, understanding that we are within nature, we're not apart from it. We are one species out of millions. And then also thinking about how do we then regenerate degraded ecosystems, conserve ecosystems and wildlife and biodiversity. And at the core of this kind of transformation is a set of values and principles. And I think this is the most important thing that we need to look at. So all these examples I'm showing you actually show one or more of these very fundamental ethics of living, ethics of relating, ethics of being, ethics of knowing. For instance, if you see the fourth bullet point here, it's much more about cooperation than competition. It's more about the commons than about privatization. Or if you see the amongst the third last bullet point, it's about doing things in a non-violent way rather than through violence. Not development as violence, but development as peace and harmony. It's about being much more self-reliant rather than dependent on somebody 1,000 kilometers away. So it's really worldviews, ways of thinking and being which are about celebrating life, not celebrating money and power and fame. So let me end in the next couple of minutes just by talking about quickly a process that we began a few years back, trying to do a lot of documentation of these examples, bring these people together to share with each other, to collaborate, to build more of a critical mass, to spread these initiatives in other parts of the country. It's called Vikalp Sangam. The word Sangam is where, like a sacred confluence of rivers. So it's really about creating that kind of a space. That's the website where you'll find hundreds of stories of the kind that I've given you. We've also been then documenting case studies in more detail. We have been also asking people to create utopian visions of the future, but also then come back down to earth and tell us how to get there. So this book on the left, Alternative Futures, it actually has Professor Damodaran, one of your colleagues, MP, has written about an ideal village, what an ideal village in Kerala could look like. So it's really, people kind of who are very experienced, but saying, okay, here's my dream vision of India for 2100. But then I come back down to the present and say, what are the pathways of getting there? And the book in the middle is the 100 examples from around the world of this kind of very interesting transformations taking place. There's lots of questions. None of us has all the answers to this. Like, okay, who will be taking the lead in this kind of transformation? What would be the role of the state or the government? Do we need the government? If so, what kind of government and what would be the role? What would business look like? Would it be all community controlled? Would there be some in the public that is the state control? If not capitalism, then what else? How does education itself change, as we've been discussing? And of course, for all of you, what is the role that the media can play? So that's now the last thing, which also partly kind of addresses one of the questions that Suhair asked. As a journalist, as a budding journalist or reporter or writer, what are the kinds of things that I should be looking out for? Unfortunately, especially because of the pressures of social media and the 24/7 media, most journalists now take shortcuts, which is to say, instead of actually going on the ground and really assessing for himself or herself what the situation is, just call up somebody who you think knows and then write the story based on that. We're all either scared or not really willing to tell the truth as it is, with, of course, obviously very good exceptions that we know of. How do we expose injustice wherever we are? And that could be even as trainee journalists. We might be seeing injustice in our lives, in the institution we're in, or our communities around us. How do we focus? How do we move that 2% of reporting of rural India to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%? Which means, in fact, deliberately do stories from rural India of things that are affecting farmers and fishers and Adivasis and women in villages and so on. I already said about slow media. So even as we use the social media, so-called social media, for maximum outreach and benefit, how do we also relearn doing long feature articles, really investigating something over a period of time and writing 5 articles based on it, not just one 500-word piece, doing a 1-hour film and not just a 1-minute video clip. You know? So these are things that we can combine, mix and match, and say, okay, what is it that would really tell the story to different audiences, and different audiences will have different media that can be used. Too much more struggle for making the mainstream media more independent than it is right now, but also support a lot of the alternative media that I spoke about, such as community and others. And always think of how do we use our skills, whether it's writing or it's arts or it's other forms of communication or it's speaking or whatever it is, to speak truth to power. And follow the example of somebody like Sainath, who started off writing just 500-word articles on what was happening in different parts of India in drought situation, and then becoming probably one of India's best known and most radical and most influential journalists. That's the kind of thing that I think each one of us needs to try and do. So let me end with that. That's my contact email ID for anybody who wants to follow up, and a number of websites that will give you much more information and exciting stories to follow up on. I will share this presentation. So Sajita and Suhair, you can also circulate it to all the students if you want. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So now it's the time for participants. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് മലയാളത്തിലും ചോദിക്കാം. If you have any ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ സംസാരിക്കുന്നതിന് ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ you can ask in Malayalam also, so that ഞങ്ങൾ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാം, സാറിനോട് ഞങ്ങൾ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാം. So you can type also in the chat box. You can type also.
Come on, somebody come up and ask some questions, please. I think environmental journalism, developmental journalism, all lacks writers. We need the youngsters to develop skills in studying and writing on this area, which is at most importance for the future.
Yes, absolutely. So I think going back to your question, partly I tried to address that, but I think unfortunately, I remember when we were in school, skills for writing were drilled into us quite heavily. These days, I don't know whether schools are still doing that. And because of the fact that we all got used to email and Twitter and so on, we're not really developing that skill of writing properly. So this is something that, again, journalist schools will have to, or colleges of journalism will have to take up. We sometimes do that in our own organization, like, people who have better writing skills will help the newer people to figure out what are the sort of systemic problems in writing they have, like whether it's grammar or it's spelling or it's style or it's other kinds of things, or it's just the flow of thoughts. And over time in Kalpurich, at least, there are 10-15 people who write quite well. I think that's the kind of mentoring also that needs to happen in the journalist world.
I request Damodaran sir to take over and make the session lively. He is the architect of Eureka and so many science journals that prompted youngsters and students to get involved in science as well as environment. So he knows a trick to get them moving.
No, so
There's
here,
a couple of things in the chat also. So
yeah,
Professor, after you.
Try to, no, let those things come out first, and then maybe I will join towards the end.
Okay, you can wind up the session now. In between, let us give some space for the participants to come up with their concerns or queries.
Yeah.
Please.
So there are two questions in chat which I'm seeing. There's Vishwalakshmi, saying, is COVID a boon or a curse? This is a very interesting question. Okay, for people who have been affected either directly by the virus or even more so by the shutdown of the economy in the way that the shutdown has taken place, it is definitely a curse. There's no doubt about that. If I lose my job because the economy has been shut down by the government, or my factory's been shut down or whatever, then it is certainly something that is not good for me. But and of course also in terms of, like I said, it's become an excuse for uh, more authoritarianism or taking the wrong kinds of decisions. But on the other hand, I think it has also made us pause as human beings to try and reassess uh, our our ways of living, our ways of dealing with each other and with the world, our development patterns, our relationship with the rest of nature. And in that sense, one can also think of it as a wake up call. Let's say it's a really tight slap in our face that this tiny little virus has given us, and it does enable a lot of us to wake up if we want to. So if we do take the long term lessons from this of the kind that I've spoken about, then it could actually be a boon, as I said, in the long run. It's I mean, in the short run, of course, it's a huge problem. So I guess that's the way I would look at it. So maybe after 10, 15, 20, 30 years, we will be able to answer that question. It's a bit too early. Nahas Abdul Haq has asked, what type of solid waste management do you advise? So, well, I think the first thing with solid waste is not to create the waste itself as far as possible. Okay, because managing the waste is a subsequent thing. So the first thing, as they say, reduce, reuse, etc., etc. Reduce, which means how can we, like in the last few weeks, I've been trying to buy everything without plastic, which is difficult, okay, because there are things that are not available. Fortunately, I have a shop not so far away from my house, where, like that zero waste shop, where I can still buy dal and rice and some sabjis and some fruits and all without plastic packaging. But not everything is available, so some things I still have to buy plastic. But can we go out of our way to try and at least reduce the waste that we are ourselves individually creating? Secondly, becoming part of advocacy efforts through civil society and media and so on, trying to push the government also into policy changes. Now, government long ago took a decision saying, okay, no more single-use plastic. But the production facilities were still allowed. So illegally, one way or the other, people were still using it. Or if we take, for instance, these small, what are they called, sachets, in which you get sopari and you get shampoo and you get all that kind of stuff, these 1 rupee kind of things or 10 rupee kind of things. We should be demanding that they be banned. They're a huge, huge, huge solid waste problem. They're all over the place, including in places where there is no city, but that waste is still there. Or even in beaches of the Andaman Islands, for instance, where nobody has thrown it there because the sea has carried it there. So, to my mind, the biggest solution to solid waste management is to reduce the waste in the first place. And that is very eminently possible if we change our consumption patterns and if we change the policies of production. However, some solid waste will, of course, still be produced. So then the question is, how do we deal with it? So the second big shift that has to happen is that whatever packaging, whatever products that are using solid materials must be made of biodegradable or easily recyclable material. One of the movements that the waste pickers groups, there's a waste pickers union, women's waste picker union in Pune. One of their biggest demands has been to, I think, to PepsiCo, saying, stop producing Lay's, stop using the kind of plastic you use for the Lay's chips packets because they can't be recycled. we can't do anything with them. They just have to be thrown. So that's actually demanding that producers, companies, have to be much more responsible about what kind of products, or what kind of materials, raw materials they use for things like packaging. The third would then be, of course, figuring out ways in our own localities, in our municipalities, wherever we are, of how do we manage the waste without burdening our waste on somebody else. So one of the examples I gave you was from this colony called uh, Rainbow Drive in Bangalore. And they took a decision many years back that they will try and recycle all of their waste. First of all, try and reduce waste to some extent, but also recycle everything, which means all the uh, vegetable waste is composted in the colony itself, and all the other solid waste is disposed of responsibly, which means make sure that it's going into recycling units and things like that. So those are the sorts of things we will have to do. But keep in mind the fact that we will still have a problem with materials that are simply not recyclable. Some of our electronic waste, for instance, is not recyclable. So how do we reduce that? How do we make a demand for computers, for instance, or mobile phones that don't use materials that are not even recyclable or that are extremely toxic? So there's many different angles to this. And there are lots of good groups in the country that are trying to deal with the solid waste issue. Bashir, fast food culture creates packaging waste. Yeah, exactly. Do we ban fast food? Well, I don't know whether we need to ban fast food, but even fast food can be given in, I mean, for instance, you go to, like near our office, there's a dosa wala. Now that dosa wala could be, a street vendor. Now that dosa and idli wala could be giving stuff in a thermocol kind of plate or in a banana leaf. I mean, you folks in Kerala, you know this better than anybody else in the country. How to use banana leaves, for instance, for things like plates or bowls. Or coconut. And across the country, you'll find different kinds of things. In central India, they use the leaves of Bohemia plant, is a big, huge, and very solid leaves. So I think we need to also figure out how fast food can actually be available in eco-friendly packaging. So it's not really about, I think fast food needs to be reduced anyway, because it's also, much of it is dangerous to health. But the packaging part is a separate, can be dealt with separately, even if some fast food continues.
Ashish, Bashir is Sultana's brother calling from UK.
Oh, okay. Hi. Hi. Say hello to Sultana also. Then I think this is maybe from Sajita. We're planning to organize a training program to improve the writing skills. Okay, great. Suggest places where these newcomers can publish their works. Yes, I think you had asked me this on the email also. So there are a number of online sites that I mean, it depends on how well it's written and how clearly it's written. But like I mentioned, if for instance some of your students do stories on, say, positive initiatives, alternative initiatives in Kerala, then we could publish it on the Vikalp Sangam website. If you give it in a way that's doesn't have too many mistakes and some pictures with it, etc. But there are other sites also. I mean, many of the online websites now, or online periodicals, do encourage or accept even new writing. But you will have to ensure in some way that the writing is competent, it's clear. It doesn't have so many spelling and grammar mistakes that I might have to spend more time looking at it, correcting it, than I would writing the whole thing myself. So those are some fundamentals that you would have to look at, which I'm sure as part of your training program you're doing. But there are certainly places which would publish those kinds of materials. And I can send you some links and contacts.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Aditya is asking about e-waste management. I am in no way an expert in, I'm an expert in creating e-waste, but not in management. So Aditya, what I can do is, if you email me, I will put you in touch with at least a couple of people I know who are doing some really good work with e-waste management. And there's been a big campaign also to make companies, especially the Indian IT companies responsible for taking back their hardware and electronic waste and offering incentives to consumers if they bring it back to their offices. I think HCL or one of them has agreed to do this already, and we have to push all the companies into doing it so that it's not an individual consumer would find it very difficult to manage the waste. But if there are centralized facilities where we can send it and then it goes back to the company to manage, that's one way to do that.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome. Then there's a question on what future do you see for environmentalists in the present scenario where a dominance of technology over nature can be seen? I think because of this, there's an even bigger future for environmentalists and human rights activists. Because if things are going wrong, then we are the ones who have to point out what's going wrong and also point to what we think are the solutions. Technology per se may or may not be a problem. It's about what kind of technology and who is in control and how it's being used. So I think I would personally, I think, for instance, that nuclear technology is inherently problematic and we should say, no, we don't agree with it. But let's say solar technologies, solar energy technologies. Now, solar energy technology can be potentially very good in the sense of providing an alternative for fossil fuels and nuclear power. But if our demand for energy keeps going up and up and up and up, then even solar energy is unsustainable. And we will find communities being displaced or wildlife areas being taken over by solar parks. So it's not just a technology issue, it's also about how our own relationships, our consumption patterns, the way our society is organized. But eventually we have to fight for the democratic control of all technologies, like I already mentioned to you. Any new technology that's coming in needs to be assessed for its ecological impact, its social impact, and its political impact. As in to say, does it increase control of people or does it increase control of the state and of corporations over us? And I think the more we fight for that kind of democratic oversight of technology, the more we will see it becoming less dominant and nature and people again becoming central to decision making. But that's a general answer. Of course, we won't have time. Again, separately, we can go into more detail on specific technologies like, say, genetic modification technologies or energy technologies or construction technologies where these sorts of transformations are taking place for much more democratization and eco-friendliness. Nas Abdul is talking about promoting biodegradable. Oh, fantastic. I'm glad you're doing that. Maybe you can write a story on how you're promoting biodegradable food packaging and we can publish that. All right, so I think that's it for the questions in the chat so far.
Okay, Ashish, then I will just butt in. And first of all, I would say that it has been a really fantastic journey. Very, very exhaustive. And you have actually touched several aspects which need, definitely, you also know that, further elaboration, further cooperation, and probably initiation of some activities and some movements within Kerala, among journalists, especially the young journalists, all these things. Because, for example, some 4 or 5 years back, Vakko Moulavi Foundation itself started organizing some of the young journalists who are actually students or just past people to come around and create materials in such a way that we could contribute to the rural generation of rural news. In fact, this was a big problem. Why I am telling that is in 1980, under the aegis of UNESCO, we had a conference on science writing. And at that time, I was the president of KSSP. And I attended that thing, made a presentation about KSSP's work. and some of the needs in this area. Because 1980, as you know, is very old time. The requirements then were very different. And we created there a small outfit, realizing that global media, if you take the whole, you are fully aware of that one, but for the benefit of the younger journalist participants, I'm telling what you said about this 2%. Global level also, this was actually 2% or sometimes zero for several countries. We never in the global media, what is happening in of the 200 countries or so, how many countries are actually represented in the global media? Many countries are actually totally absent. We mean say that nothing is happening there, there are no problems. So this had been a big thing. And when this issue was actually discussed in UNESCO, the reaction of the developed countries were to withdraw support to UNESCO, withdrew their membership, as recently what Trump has done about after the Paris conference, UNFCCC. So the same technique was actually doing. And similarly, after the COVID also, what has actually happened is you withdraw from WHO. So this has been a killing of such international efforts has been going on. And the best hacking was actually on the media control. So what we wanted was to create a kind of reporting, at least in the name of science and science popularization, get some news or give little voice to the less represented rural areas, as well as some countries which are totally in oblivion. So this was our purpose. But I think we could go on for about 4 to 5 years. Then again, there were a lot of problems because that was partly supported by a sub-agency of the UNESCO. Under UNESCO, the ICSU, that is International Council of Scientific Union, under that the Committee on Science and Technology, developing countries, costed, and then under that some other mechanism. So we were only trying to tag on to this costed, and we found that the same mechanism which did in a big way in the global level, they also tried to crush this, and finally, after 5 years, this movement lost. But now with Wikipedia and social media, we have actually a new platform and a new tool coming. And this is where, that is what I mentioned in my initial thing also. This is where actually we should think of devising some ways. In fact, Madhav Gadgil actually came to one of our Wikipedia workshop, and in fact, he himself stayed here for 2 or 3 days and guided us. But I think our participants were not able to follow his advice and the suggestions he gave in creating some stories from various local areas from where they come, so that their place will be actually represented or rather reported into some of this media in journalism. But we could not do that. We definitely, because we also didn't have a mechanism within us that is a senior journalist guide to consistently support and encourage the young people who are coming. So that was actually probably one of the mistakes. And we now, having heard your thing, I feel that this our journalism club has to go on more seriously and more continuously, persistent and consistently, so that we can try to generate, because from Kerala, it is not so much difficult to generate, but for international consumption, putting it in English language will be a little difficult in the beginning, but at least in Malayalam itself, we may be able to create some content, which selectively probably some of us or somebody in the KSSP or some other movements here in Kerala itself, you know, many of them, Tanal and so many other people, they could probably try to selectively translate some of these things. And the second problem at that time itself, what I felt is, of course, my contacts were not very continuous again with these people and their classes. Their problem is what they write, there is no medium to carry. Every journalist want to write only if his writing is actually read by somebody else. So this is actually the carrier is very important. And of course, you are now offered that you could carry some of the stories, but then we should think in terms of developing this more or less evenly in different parts of India. And many movements like taking over of agriculture and management of what you call post-harvest scenario. These are actually very important and far-reaching. So how in our Kerala situation, what happens is, for example, that education, you showed some European example where parents participate as volunteers in teaching, and so reducing the cost of education, especially where the cost of education is very high. So that is a good method. But in Kerala, what happens is, if you have a system like that, you don't have an accreditation method by which any certificate given by such an institution is actually recognized outside, so that they will get employment. Because here we cannot actually employ all the people who pass out from Kerala. So this is one scenario. And in many urban areas and few other states, same scenario is there. So here again, we have to actually think in terms of devising some methods, incorporating some of these principles, and try to kind of mold a method of resisting this what you call kind of affront on environment, affront on our own community independence, and all such things which are actually social evils we have actually kind of accumulated and perpetuated. So this is probably a social revolution, a kind of a renaissance that is required. And I think just because of that one, what I would say is that we need few more sessions with you in future also on some of the issues that you have actually thrown here, elaborating further. I think Engineer Suhair and Dr. Sajita and others will be open to that kind of a continuing interaction. And maybe within once this COVID situation eases a little bit more. But in fact, it was highly inspiring for me to see that some of the rural communities in India, they are actually completely going functional. That is, all their activities, agriculture and other activities going on even under COVID conditions is really an excellent and bold initiative which other parts of India also should copy. I think we should try to expand some of these ideas and try to work together. So that is my request, and I'm sure you will always be willing. But yet, it is good that you say that at least some of these things could be probably wrapped by joint efforts. So that's all I have to say. And anyhow, I really appreciate. And had I missed this talk, it would have been really a loss. That is my last reaction on that. Thank you very much for sparing so much time on this. And I think there will be a formal vote of thanks, Sajida. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Just before that, to just say that, Professor, thanks for that I think a lot of very important observations, especially about mentoring and sustaining this kind of effort in so many ways. And yes, I would be happy to have further interactions with the students and with all of you whenever needed. So I'm available whenever you think it's necessary.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Professor Vikedi sir, and thank you very much, Ashish Kotedi sir. Actually, tomorrow, after fixing our session, the university announced exams, and tomorrow most of our students, they have exam. So I was worried that they won't be here till the end, but I think most of them, they remind us till sir's presentation and all. But at the same time, I'm very happy and excited that Vikedi sir also mentioned it properly, and Kothari sir also accepted it, that it's not the first and the last session, and we just started, and we will have more interactions and more sessions. Now I actually invite one of the club member, Vishalakshmi, to give the formal vote of thanks. Vishalakshmi?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. എന്നിൽ നിക്ഷിപ്തമായിരിക്കുന്ന കർത്തവ്യം നന്ദി അർപ്പിക്കുക എന്നതാണ്. ആദ്യമായി നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തേണ്ടത് എക്കോസ്വരാജ് ടുവേർഡ്സ് എ റെയിൻബോ റിക്കവറി ഓഫ് ഇന്ത്യ എന്ന വിഷയത്തിൽ വളരെ ആധികാരികമായി സംസാരിക്കുകയും അറിവുകൾ പകർന്നു തരികയും ചെയ്ത ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട ശ്രീ ആശിഷ് കോത്താരി സാറിനാണ്. സാറിന് സ്വദേശാഭിമാനി യങ് ജേർണലിസ്റ്റ് ക്ലബിന്റെ പേരിലുള്ള നന്ദി ബഹുമാനപൂർവ്വം അറിയിച്ചുകൊള്ളുന്നു. താങ്ക് യു സോ മച്ച് ആശിഷ് സർ ഫോർ യുവർ ഇൻസ്പയറിംഗ് ആൻഡ് ഇൻഫോർമേറ്റീവ് വേർഡ്സ്. We are really grateful to have you here. Thank you. അടുത്തതായി നമ്മൾ എല്ലാവരും സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്ത് സംസാരിച്ച വക്ക മൗലവി ഫൗണ്ടേഷൻ ട്രസ്റ്റിന്റെ ചെയർമാൻ ശ്രീ എ സുഹൈർ സാറിനാണ് നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തേണ്ടത്. സാറിനോടുള്ള നന്ദി ബഹുമാനപൂർവ്വം അറിയിച്ചുകൊള്ളുന്നു. അടുത്തതായി നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തേണ്ടത് നമ്മെ അഭിമുഖീകരിച്ച് സംസാരിക്കുകയും അറിവുകൾ പകർന്നു തരികയും ചെയ്ത ശ്രീ വി കെ ദാമോദരൻ സാറിനാണ്. സാറിന് സ്വദേശാഭിമാനി യങ് ജേർണലിസ്റ്റ് ക്ലബിന്റെ പേരിലുള്ള നന്ദി ബഹുമാനപൂർവ്വം അറിയിച്ചുകൊള്ളുന്നു. അടുത്തതായി ഇത്രയും നല്ലൊരു വെബിനാർ നമുക്ക് വേണ്ടി ഒരുക്കി തന്ന സ്വദേശാഭിമാനി യങ് ജേർണലിസ്റ്റ് ക്ലബിന്റെ പ്രോഗ്രാം ഡയറക്ടർ ഡോക്ടർ ഒ ജി സജിത മാഡത്തിനാണ് നന്ദി അറിയിക്കേണ്ടത്. മാഡത്തിന് ക്ലബ് മെമ്പേഴ്സിന്റെ പേരിലുള്ള നന്ദി സസ്നേഹം അറിയിക്കുന്നു. അടുത്തതായി നന്ദി അറിയിക്കേണ്ടത് വളരെ നല്ലൊരു രീതിയിൽ ഈ വെബിനാർ കോർഡിനേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത വോളണ്ടിയേഴ്സിനാണ്. വോളണ്ടിയേഴ്സിനുള്ള നന്ദി സ്നേഹപൂർവ്വം അറിയിക്കുന്നു. ഇത്രയും സമയം ഈ വെബിനാറിൽ പങ്കെടുക്കുകയും അഭിപ്രായങ്ങളും ചോദ്യങ്ങളും അവതരിപ്പിക്കുകയും ചെയ്ത എല്ലാവർക്കും സ്വദേശാഭിമാനി യങ് ജേർണലിസ്റ്റ് ക്ലബിന്റെ പേരിലുള്ള നന്ദി സ്നേഹപൂർവ്വം അറിയിക്കുന്നു. ഏവർക്കും ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടി നന്ദി അർപ്പിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ എന്റെ കർത്തവ്യത്തിൽ നിന്ന് വിരമിക്കുന്നു. നന്ദി, നമസ്കാരം. താങ്ക് യു.
Thank you, Vishalakshmi.
Welcome, ma'am.
So we will meet again. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ashish.
Sajita, if you can share the recording with me whenever it's available.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
Thank you.
Great job, man. Good job, Ashish.